Hi everybody, so welcome to this short demonstration video on using a jelly plate. Um, Basically what I'm going to do is demonstrate for you some of the ways I've been exploring using these new techniques. Most of what I've been doing has been about creating monoprints, kind of layering colour and keeping the compositions really simple. I will at the first part of the video though spend a bit of time showing you how I've been using it to create collage papers, and so you can have a look at that and see what you think. That is certainly one of the ways I see lots of people using a jelly plate. One of the things I've found though, that I enjoy more in fact, is to create kind of little compositions using the plate to create like an entire print. So I hope you enjoy this, and yeah, have some fun with your jelly plates afterwards. Okay, see you all soon guys. So here I am with the jelly plate. As you can see, there's still some residual paint left on it from when I've made previous use of it. I quite like to leave that there because it actually lifts and becomes part of the texture. I've got together some small sheets of paper, fairly cheap drawing paper, and then again some more paper there. Slightly thicker weight here. I think this is probably about 160 GSM. One of the things I've found that works particularly well is to have a very smooth surface to the paper. Got here some toned tan paper by Strathmore. Again, this is quite interesting because what it does is where there is little gaps in the paint is that you can see it starts to show through. So I'm going to begin with some stenciling. I'm making some collage paper as a first start. So I've got together a selection of various different bits and pieces to make some collaging paper. And for this, I'm probably going to use just the cheap drawing paper as a beginning. So we're going to start off by gathering together my tools, and then we'll make a start. Getting here some extra sheets of paper. Again, this is just some cheap paper just for the purposes of the demonstration. One of the things I have found that's quite useful with the paper is the smoother the surface, the better it works. If it's got too much of a tooth on it, it doesn't actually pick the paint up from the plate smoothly, and you end up with a kind of fairly random looking texture showing through, which I don't particularly like. So I'm starting with some black paint, some basic black acrylic paint. You can see I'm just bringing the plate up to the camera, the jelly plate up to the camera, and you can see that there's some residual paint left on that. So start off with a smallish squirt of paint. Don't need a lot actually, because with the roller it does spread it quite smoothly and evenly over the surface, and actually what you're looking for is a fairly thin layer of paint to begin with. So take the roller and distribute the paint smoothly and evenly over the surface. And as you're working it, you'll notice as you're rolling it out that it can be a little bit patchy. And one of the things that I've noticed that helps with that is if you go in different directions and just basically keep working the paint until you've got a nice smooth surface. Certainly for making, excuse me, making collaging papers, using stencils and stuff like that, it works better if you've got a nice smooth coat of paint. So I'm starting with a couple of shapes. I'm going to basically do some masking here. Decided that shape won't work. And what I'm going to do is basically put the paper across this, and as I lift it off, you'll see that the two shapes are left. I'm going to create a little bit of a pattern as well in the area of the plate that hasn't got the two shapes on it, to create a little bit more texture as we're going along. So for this, I'm just using a fork and drawing lines in the paint. And of course, you can do this with any kind of object. You could get cotton reels, for example, and press those into the paint, and they would form a pattern. You could use any kind of scraping or line drawing implement to create a pattern in the paint. You could cut thin strips of paper. I've got two circles there, but you could cut thin strips of paper or blocks of paper and lay those on the surface of the plate and use those to create a pattern. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this to make these kind of patterned collaging papers. I'm not going to do a huge amount in this demonstration video of this because this is not something I use a great deal in my work. But I'm just doing this now for the purposes of just showing you how it works. Whoops. That yeah, not a good thing to do, because when you've scrunched the paper up like that, obviously that the paint is not going to, you're not going to get a clean print. But as you can see, I mean, that's come off really nicely. two very clear circular shapes apart from that corner, and you can see the lines as well in the design, and that's actually quite nice, isn't it? I think as a kind of piece of pattern collaging paper. Now, one of the things I actually like quite a lot, and in some respects almost prefer to the first print, is what's left afterwards. So this kind of residual second print, I often think can sometimes be slightly more interesting, as you'll see in a minute once I do this. So again, take a sheet of paper, use the roller just to make sure that I've got a nice clean print and plenty of the paint is lifted. Lift it carefully back, and as you can see, it's a bit more random, and I quite like the randomness of that compared to the sort of evenness sometimes that you get. It depends on what you're looking for, I think. So that's using the jelly plate and masking out areas. I think the next thing I'm going to do is show you what it's like to use some of the stencils. So basically these are cheap plastic stencils bought from a kind of craft shop. They're not very big, so they're only going to cover a small amount of the page. But again, the same process is to apply a thin, even coat of paint to the jelly plate using the roller, and then to place the stencils carefully on the plate and then print off it. Now there's a couple of things you can do here. You can press the stencil into the plate and lift it, and it will have left a pattern in the depth of the paint, so you could do it that way, or you can put the stencil on like I'm going to do here and leave it on the surface and then take a print. So I'm just using a small piece of cheap drawing paper here just to lift that, and we'll see what we get. So I'm going to use some of the other kind of stencils that I've got in the remaining space on the plate. Yeah, really nice, clean print at this stage because the paint is still nice and thick, quite nice and damp, and it's going to lift quite well onto that paper. And then when you've used those stencils, just pop them in some warm water and the paint will wash off nice and easily. But again, as I said before, one of the things that I quite like at this stage is the second print, which I'm just going to lift off now and see what we've got. So press it down firmly. So it's not lifted so well at the far end where I was using those little circular stencils, but at the far left hand side where I was using that sort of brick square shaped stencil, it's come off really well actually. I really like that. So as you can see, that's quite a good print there. So we've got a bit of something going on there, and we'll just lift that off as well and see what that looks like. Well, we masked it out using the that sort of square shape. Okay, so that's really using the jelly plate to create sort of stenciled patterns, which is something that you see people do quite a bit, I think. So here I'm taking a very small silicone wedge and using it to draw in some patterns onto the page and just see what we've got when we do that. So again, this is more creating collaging papers using different tools to create interesting patterns. That's quite interesting. And that one there. So that's quite delicate, isn't it? It's quite a subtle sort of print. I quite like that. So what I'm moving into now is showing you how I use the plate to create monoprints by layering different colour. So as you can see, there's a lot of black still left on that plate, and there's also quite a bit black still probably left on that roller. But I am using some fluid acrylic. These are golden fluid acrylics over the top of that black paint. And what you'll see when I take the next print is that it will lift. It's going to lift that plate paint up. As you can see there, you can see the surface of the plate. The paint is not evenly spread. In fact, I've done it deliberately so that it's got lines and track marks and variations in it, because I want that to come through into the print. So this is where I start to get quite excited actually about the possibilities of using a jelly plate and what you can do with it. So, and you can see here as well, the way in which I'm laying out the paper on the plate is I'm using it to create a kind of composition. So you've got a little bit of something starting to happen there. And there as well. Not great, but it's starting to look a little bit interesting with those two colours. There was probably a little bit too much black left on that plate actually, because it's made that deep red go a little bit muddy. So I'm going to carry on with that process now, showing you how I layer the colour, and I'm going to show you how I do it with a few different colours to get some of the effects that you might have seen on some of the printing. So this is just some very cheap acrylic craft paint. Actually works quite well because it's quite fluid. I do find the slightly more fluid paints do tend to give a little bit of a better result, unless it's black or white and you want a quite dense colour. With those, actually, I find that the slightly thicker paint works better. I think it's a case of trying it out to see what you find suits you better according to how you want to use the plate. So again, I'm spreading the paint quite lightly. I'm looking to create texture in the paint on the plate, if that makes sense, in the paint, in the surface of the paint on the plate, so it's not completely smooth and even. There are some patterns in that, and I'm going to print up to the edge of where that small piece of paper is already printed, so you've got some kind of composition happening. And the same with this tan paper as well. I'm going to do the same here. So I'm creating shapes and compositions, or starting to get the idea of a composition anyway, on these pieces of paper as I'm laying it onto the plate. As you can see, I'm using multiple pieces of paper at the same time so that I can use the whole of the surface of the plate and all the paint that's on there. Then you give it a quick going over with the roller to make sure you've lifted it all up, and then we start to see what we've got. So you can see how the black is lifted underneath and the residual paint is lifted up. So we've just got a nice little line there. That's quite interesting. And then that starts to look quite interesting, doesn't it, with that little bit of purple actually showing through there from a previous print, some black along the edge. And you can see in the orange how it's not even. It's got some texture in it, and that's because of how I laid the paint down initially. And the same with this piece as well. It's picked up lots of paint that was already there on the surface, and it starts to look, I think it starts to look quite juicy, actually. At this point, I like that. And then we've got that one there. So I'm trying to see if I can lift up the rest of that paint because it didn't get a clean print, and it's not. It's dried too much at this stage. It's not going to lift. Okay, so we've got something there. So let's see what else we can do. Go with a raw umber, burnt umber actually, and yellow ochre, I think, are the two colours that I've chosen. So this is inexpensive student quality acrylic paint, which tends to be, I tend to use a lot of this in my work anyway. I've got too much brown out there, so I keep these tubs of pre-mixed paint of colours that I tend to use a lot of. And I know that that brown is part of the mix that I use, so I've just got rid of it in there. But what I'm doing here is, I'm being a bit lazy actually, is that rather than putting the paint out on a stay wet palette and pre-mixing it, I'm basically putting a little blob of black with a little blob of brown on the plate, and then I'm mixing it together on the plate using a palette knife, being careful not to scratch or damage actually the surface of the jelly plate. And then I'm just using the roller to distribute the paint. And to be honest with you, that works fine. So what I've mixed here is a very deep dark brown by mixing black and burnt umber together. And I think you'll see in a minute that it creates a really nice colour. I really like it anyway. So putting a little bit of texture in this by drawing some lines into the paint. And then we're going to print the bottom half of these little prints that I've already started and see what we've got. Okay, nice clean dark mark there. So what I'm doing now is making a bigger shape at the bottom half of this print. There we go, by doing a sort of double lift, but as you can see, the second lift is much lighter, so it becomes quite interesting. Okay, so again with that one, it's quite dark and also there's a big gap in the middle, so I'm filling in the space by lifting up some of the residual paint. And you can see there's some nice lines forming in there. So what I'm doing now is gently pressing the orange onto the brown so that it picks up a little bit of that brown from the bottom half, so that it again carries that colour across the whole of the print. So now we're thinking about what colour to use next. Still got quite a bit of residual paint though left on that plate, so I'm going to see what it looks like once I lift that off on that piece of paper that's only got that small bit of orange on it. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? So you can see that those dark marks, if they get printed over with a lighter colour, would make quite an interesting sort of composition. So I think at this stage we're going to go for this nice neutral. So we need to mix this back in first. There we go, all mixed, and here we go. So we put the paint on the plate. Oops, there we go. We've got too much dark left on that, I think, there. And then we're going to go over it with that light colour. So this is quite interesting actually, because as you can see, there's a strip of sort of dark paint that's now sitting underneath that light colour, as well as all the residual paint that's left from the previous print. And what will happen when I kind of take a print off this is some of that paint will lift up. And we should get some quite interesting effects. So I'm going to go for that larger piece, that piece that's hardly got any other colour on it there. There's a nice, plenty of space to print onto. And on this one, we only want a little bit along the edge just to fill in some of that gap, because we've still got plenty of dark on that, so we only really want to So you can see that I'm thinking about the shapes that I've got available to me on the plate and how they're going to look when I actually position the paper on top. Where the shapes are going to form. You can really see there, I think, how the light coloured paint has pulled up the dark paint underneath it and how interesting that is. And again with that one, you can see it there as well. So that big dark stripe down the right hand side of that print is formed by the fact that there was dark paint underneath that first. So it's kind of mixed really on the plate. And what I'm doing now is wanting to lift some of that lighter paint so that it forms some texture within those darker shapes at the bottom half of those prints so that it isn't quite so flat. Yeah, and you can just see it's just lifted up a little bit and it's just given it a little bit more interest. And there's still a big bit at the bottom of the plate, so we're going to try and lift some of that, I think. Or maybe not. So there's a gap there. I'm thinking, do I want to put something in that or not? I think we're probably going to try for that. Yes, we're going to go for that this time, seeing if we can lift some of that light coloured paint that's just still on the bottom edge. And there we go, it's worked quite nicely. Okay. So there's a big space there. And there's quite a bit of space on that one as well, along the edges. So time to pop those to dry, and now time to bring out another colour. So clean off the roller and remove the rest of that light coloured paint. And at this point we're going to pick up some pink. I think pink with that neutral beige and that deep brown should look really good. So again, the same thing's going to happen here because there's some light coloured paint left on, quite wet light coloured paint actually that was left on the roller that I then transferred onto the plate. And now we're putting pink over the top. That again will create some interesting textures and kind of effects as we begin to print off it. So starting with some of that clean white paper now. Now you're seeing what the effect is of using the tan coloured paper. We're going to go to some white and see what kind of effects we can get with that, and we're going to see if we can fill in some of the gaps on these earlier little tan coloured prints and see what that looks like with the pink against that brown. So I really like the way that that pink and brown has worked together and created that lovely texture and that lovely textured patch of sort of pink and brown and neutral beige actually paint. I think it's been really effective. So that's quite an exciting little process there, I think. And I'll probably repeat that actually on other prints. So the next stage with those will be to think about what other colours I want to use alongside them. But as you can see, that one's kind of pretty much finished now, that one on the tan paper, and that one's also probably finished as well. Might try and pick up a little bit more pink just to distribute it throughout the print so that you get a more even kind of feel. It feels more integrated. There we go. But that's pretty much it for those. So I hope you can see how this is, you know, in many respects, it's really a process of trial and error. You don't quite know what you're going to get when you, you know, first start out with this. And also because, you know, you're turning things over and trying to figure out where to sort of put the prints so that you try and get them to fill in certain shapes. It doesn't always work, but you do get some really interesting, I think, some really interesting textures and kind of paint effects really happening as a result of layering the paint. So again, I'm mixing the brown with the black again on the plate. I think I'm going to be using some more of this sort of deep, rich brown with this pink. And then we'll take it from there and see what we've got. So this is an example where there's too much paint on the plate, too thick, and it'll create too denser, flatter colour for what I want to, the effect that I want to get. So I've just used a piece of cheap drawing paper just to lift some of the paint off. And as you can see, there's some sort of orangey marks underneath. That's already looking better than it was, so I won't get such a thick, dense print off it, which is not what I want really. I want something with a bit more texture so that you can kind of see the other paints and some of the other paint and some of the marks underneath. Interesting. So that pink and brown looks slightly different on the white, doesn't it? It's that sort of brownish paper underneath it slightly altered the tone, I think, of the colours, but I quite like it on the white. Sometimes I do use pieces of paper that have got kind of bits of paint on them from previous experiments, so sometimes they show through, sometimes they get completely obliterated. That can be quite interesting to play around with as well, actually. I'm not going to show you much of that on this demonstration today, actually. I'm just going to focus on what we're looking at here, which is just how to use the plate in this way and create these prints by creating simple compositions, layering the paint to get all this rich texture. So sometimes like there, I want to be sort of as precise as you can get, really, with this sort of technique, trying to fill in certain gaps and sometimes it works fine actually, and sometimes it ends up in completely wrong place. But I mean, some of that might be my ability to be able to turn something over and work out where it was. But I'm quite pleased with how those have turned out. So we've still got quite a few. So you can see how with this technique and this way of working that you can make some quite interesting little prints very, very quickly actually, and quite a lot of them. Not that it's about that necessarily, but you know, it can be quite good fun in a morning to, get quite a lot of very interesting little pieces of work going, actually, that then might lead on to other things. But even these, whether you decided to keep them just as prints, or if you decided to use them as collaging papers, they work equally well, I think. Because sometimes it's really nice to have a collage paper that's got different shapes and colours into it that you collage into a bigger painting. And certainly that's what I've been doing with some of these, is using them in that way. So I'm mixing together some black with some cadmium red deep here, which makes a really deep, rich burgundy red. It's a lovely colour actually, because I thought that would go quite well with alongside some of that pink. So to fill in some of those little gaps alongside that dark. So it's quite a nice reddy pink, deep reddy pink that we've got here. And as you can see from this example, there's nothing stopping you having, several pieces of paper on the go at the same time. In fact, I think that probably makes it an easier process to work with, rather than trying to only do like one or two bits of paper at once. Actually having multiple pieces like this does actually make it easier, I think, because it creates shapes on the plate that you can then print off. So I've got about 6 pieces, I think, going there, something like that. And then some of them are finished, like those with the pale pink on. And others, again, I'd be, doing the plate to add more paint to it, and then moving on to create yet more prints of a different colour. Maybe put some red on those, some bright red on these. Take it in a different direction. So each time I think you start to add more paint to the plate, you can use a different colour and it will pull up paint from underneath, creating lovely textures, and also allow you to start to take your prints in a different direction. So yeah, it's kind of endless, actually. It is, it's great fun. So this is the last round, I think, of printing I'm going to do with these few. So we're going to go with the deep red, knowing that actually will tone really well with the colours we've already got. And that actually is another point that I've not made. I'm just thinking as I've been talking, which is it is a good idea to have to be thinking about the colours that are going to go, what colour's going to go with what as you're doing this. As you've seen me go from brown to sort of ochre to pink to dark brown to pale pink to deep red. So they're all within the same, apart from the ochre, all within the same kind of spectrum, using browns and pinks, all colours that go really well together. So I think that's quite important, actually, is how you're mixing and using your colour as you're doing this. Oh, that looks quite exciting, doesn't it, with that bright red? So I'm going to want to fill in that lighter area there, perhaps pick up a bit more red on that one. So the last thing I'm going to do is to show you what happens when you use a fluid white, which is what I've got here, using golden acrylics, fluid white, over the top of a plate which has still got some residual paint on it like this. Like I've shown you before, it very much picks up the paint that's underneath, but with white I think you get a particularly lovely effect because of the contrast, I think, more than anything. So you can really see the secondary colour that's sitting underneath when you do the lift, when you do the print, as you'll see in just a minute. So you can see how the white started to lift the red, and also I think because it's red underneath it's also showing through, but that you can see particularly clearly there because that is white paper with the red over the top. With white paper with the white over the top, but picking up the red, so you get a really clear print on that particular piece. Just cleaning off that roller to see if there's any more left that we can pick up. And that is really creating monoprints using a jelly plate. So as you can see, I'm using a lot of my kind of techniques that are very much part of my work. You know, strong architectural forms and shapes alongside layering of paint, using lots of texture. And I'm allowing the lines, I think, that are formed between the way the edges, where the shapes meet up against each other to form the composition rather than drawing in with line afterwards. And that felt different, actually. That's felt interesting and good. So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed the demonstration.